Today, as I said, we have Ted Williams on the call, and he is a human resources consultant. Ted, would you please tell us a bit about your experience?
Yes, the Williams Group was started in 1987 in Berkeley, California, and we've been at it for a while. We actually moved to the East Coast for a few years in the New York area, and then in the mid-90s, we moved to Iowa. Now, how did we come from Berkeley to New York to Iowa? Well, to be perfectly honest, as a consultant, I was hired on a long-term basis by the Iowa Board of Regents to add some consistency to their system-wide HR component. And it was for a specific amount of time. I had a 3-year appointment, and although each Regents University, University of Iowa, Iowa State University, University of Northern Iowa, Iowa School for the Deaf, and Iowa School for the Blind had their own respective HR VPs, they hired me to provide some consistency, because there were situations where you could do something at the University of Iowa that could get you fired at Iowa State. The same thing.
Right.
And as you can imagine, the Regents system did not necessarily require every university to do everything the same way, but at least consistently. So when my 3-year stint was up, I was still doing consulting, but not in the Midwest, because I did not want any kind of conflict of interest issues to come up. I included, because I had clients from the South, the West, and the East, and now I could acquire clients from the Midwest. And we've been doing this for some time. The Williams Group operates in 21 different industries. So we get a good feel for what's happening nationwide. We have clients who are architects, engineers, physicians, manufacturing, large clients with as many as 15,000 employees, and some clients with as little as 5. So we go across the spectrum, and what we've learned is if we can assist our clients in the workforce challenges they have, then they can dedicate their focus on performance, productivity, and profits. So that's what our fort is. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that's very topical and timely. What are we going to do once this COVID has been conquered, and how do we deal with that workforce? For many of us, we've laid off people, furloughed them is the term I think we use, and we either are bringing them back to the workplace on site, or we are still leaving some of them at the workplace at home. And we're going to be talking about those challenges that many of you may have. And so I'm going to ask for the next slide, please. My focus today is what you will learn. And it's geared toward us making sure you have insight from the vantage point of a workforce expert's point of view. I see this every day. You do other things other than human resources. You do executive level decision making. You deal with finance. There are any number of things that you do. And for this point in time, I'm going to share with you how HR operates, particularly for many of you who may not have the capacity to hire an $80,000 full-time HR manager. In many cases, you are that HR manager. And so we're going to be talking about some of the things that you will learn, which we believe will help you manage, lead, and succeed at communication in the workplace. If you thought about it, leadership, team building, conflict resolution, management, all of these, to me, are subsets of communication. If you can't communicate with your employees, you can't direct them to do the things that your clients and your customers need. I grew up in a mom and pop grocery in the heart of a depressed neighborhood in Memphis, Tennessee. My father was the owner, and he had this one point of view. At all times, the customer is right. That's rule number one. Rule number two, if you misunderstood rule number one, here's rule number two. You're in deep trouble with me. Rule number three, do not forget rule number two. So I can tell you, particularly for those of you who have smaller businesses, you all know, like we knew, your margin of error is a lot slimmer than if you were a large corporation. You can't expense everything. You can't hide it over into another arena. So you need a workplace and a workforce that is streamlined and literally clicking on all cylinders. So I'm hoping that this workshop will give you some new communication skills, some new techniques, some approaches that you hadn't thought about, and some strategies that I believe will separate you from perhaps your competition. Next slide, Catherine, please. So return to work. Here we are, July 15th, 16th rather, and you, like other employers, are trying to figure out how and what you should do regarding the best way to bring back your staff to work. And here are the questions I would imagine you're thinking about. When should we reopen? Should all employees come back at once, or should we recall employees in waves? If I don't call employees back at the same time, who should I recall first and why? What safety and social distancing protocols should be in place? Should we let the employee's personality trump, to coin a phrase, his or her performance? These, and I'm sure you have many more questions, but these are the questions that I'm hearing from my clients in terms of what should we do with return to work. Put on top of that, that may be legal, state, and federal challenges that will or will not allow you to do certain things. Next slide, please. Okay, the elephant in the room. Should employees allow an employee's personality to overrule needed performance? What I mean is, I'm constantly dealing with situations where you as an owner or you as an employee are doing your best to accommodate the needs of your employees. And then you have to weigh that against what your needs are. Can your business marry up with the needs perceived and alleged that your employees have? And to be honest with you, as an owner, as a manager, I am strongly supportive that the company's needs have to come first. Because if you don't take care of the company's needs, you don't have any employee needs. If your doors aren't open, that's not an issue. Will managers fall prey to undue pressure from the employee or from his or her boss when making return to work decisions? If you're going to recall people and you're going to do it by priority, you have to make a decision as who is more valuable to you in terms of performance and in terms of responding to customer or client needs. Not Joe's a good guy, he's been with us for 5 years, he's the sole breadwinner, he needs to be back here more than Bill, who is the subject matter expert and has been here 6 months, but we kind of have a loose seniority system, but let's look out for the other guy first. No. Who can best serve the needs of your company when servicing your clients or your customers? That to me is a priority. Can the employer justify allowing special dispensation from one employee over fairness for other staff? Make no mistake, I was just with a client this morning and the issue of fairness came up. What's fairness? You know, let me explain to you how fairness works in my world. You know, if I ask you to describe beauty, and I had 40 people in the room, I wouldn't be surprised if we had 40 different approaches to what's beautiful.
Sure.
However, if I said, let's describe ugly, I would have a majority or a consensus no matter who's in the room, no matter what country they came from, no matter what gender, no matter what race, we can all agree on ugly. Now, how can we agree on ugly, yet we can't agree on beauty? The same thing with fairness. We know fair play when we see it. And we know when something is not fair when we see it. I don't care what your policies and procedures say. I don't care what your past practices say. I don't care what the last memo said. Folks know when you've been fair. And you know how you know they know when you've been fair? Look at your turnover. Look at your recruitment. Look at your retention. If you're not fair, they may stay with you until they get another job. I have clients who sometimes pay 20% below market in wages and salaries and have less than 1% turnover. Why do you think that's so? Because it's a fair place to work. And many times people will forego needed money to remain at a place where the environment is one of harmony and fairness. Now, I'm not suggesting, it's just like families. If I could change some of my relatives, I might consider it, but I can't. You know, I got to deal with Uncle Joe. Fortunately, I only see him on Thanksgiving. But the fact is, don't get caught in the trap of thinking you can give special dispensation to one employee and it will not be noticed by the other employees.
Right.
That impacts morale.
Right.
That impacts performance. And I want you to be thinking about that. Or as I had an employee say this morning, I go back with the owner, we go back, and so he'll give me this little thing. The problem was this particular employee was one of the biggest non-performers on staff, and everybody knew it. And I had to tell the owner, if you think that little deal you cut with Bill that you thought was in private, that nobody knows about, they all know about it. So please rethink what you did. The other question is the employer prepared for the organization and possible legal fallout that can ensue due to favoritism? You know, a lot of times we don't realize that what we think, I'm the owner, I'm the manager, I have free range to do what I want. The problem with that is we have laws, we have guidelines, we have regulations. And let's face it, these days, I don't care who you are, everybody has a relative who's a lawyer now. My cousin, the lawyer, told me I could do such and such and such. It may be wrong, but the fact of the matter is, it may cost you needed time to deal with that. Even if it's not a good case, you still have to deal with it to get rid of it. So I would stay away from favoritism. I would look at what I need and why I need it. I would document it. And think about this, you're the owner. You could be completely wrong. But if you're consistent and you use your rationale and make sense to you, I wouldn't worry about a lawsuit. I'm less worried about a lawsuit than I am about employee morale.
Right.
And don't think because folks are at home that they don't call each other and discuss stuff. Zoom is not just for meetings, okay? Next slide, Catherine, please.
Okay.
So return to work. The response, of course, to these questions varies. They depend on what's your business. Is your facility one that can deal with everybody coming back at the same time? And by the way, we have a whole new reality. We're never going to go back to what we were used to. Let me give you an example. one of my clients noticed that employees were turning in work at 10 p.m. at night, at 1 a.m. in the morning. And the concern was that's bad enough for professional people, because we want them to take time out, set boundaries. For hourly people, it has an even more immediate concern. If an hourly person at the end of the week works more than 40 hours, you, the employer, are responsible for that time and a half. So if somebody is doing work at 10:30 at night and they've done their 8 hours, at the end of that week, they may have incurred an additional 8 to 10 hours of overtime that you have to pay. You cannot refuse to pay it, but you can warn the employee, don't do that in the future, but you have to pay for it. And if they do it again, then it's a performance issue and you can discipline them. But here's my point, back to my original statement. The management was concerned. We have people clocking in at that time of night. We want boundaries and we want to make sure we can keep down our costs. One employee during the Zoom meeting brought up a point, and here was the point. Well, there may be a reason for this that you didn't think about. Today, it was a very sunny day. I took my son fishing during the middle of the day for 3 hours. And we caught fish and we had a great time. When I got back home, I knew I owed the company 3 hours. So when I got back home, we had dinner, we took our showers, blah, blah, blah. I began work. So that's why you saw me reporting in at 11 p.m. A new paradigm. We were so focused on making sure that the employee stayed within the allotted 8 hours that then we didn't realize that what the employees had done is custom tailored a new way to work. Now the question becomes, do we really care? If it's an hourly person, it's still an issue because we don't want to get in that time and a half situation. But if it's a professional person or a management person, do we really care what time the work's done? A whole new look at the workplace. Guess what? That might be an issue when we bring them back on site. That may be something that we will be doing in the future. Middle of the day, somebody takes off and goes fishing with his son and comes back to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much of what you said of like, what are the needs of the company, right? And if it can.
So we're being pushed into a new reality. We're being pushed into a new realm. Who came up with that idea? Not management. It was an employee who said, this works for me. And when management thought about it, management said, in that particular case, it works for management. Let's look at the location. Let's look at the number of workers. How about the work available and other factors? How do you deal with vacation when someone's at home? And then how do you square that when half of your employees are back at the work site and the remainder are working at home? Do you have two sets of rules for the at-home workers? Or do you have one set of rules and you're rigid about it? Or do you have rules that recognizes the differences between the two, but still strives for fairness? It is a slippery slope. But you know what? Every one of you who runs a business are faced with flexible challenges every day anyway. This is no different. We may call it COVID-19. Next year it might be Banana 801. I don't know. But my point being is, I want you to think, what's that term they talk about, outside the box? Not only do I want you to think outside the box, I want you outside the box. I want you outside the room that the box is in. I want you outside the building that the room that the box is in. And I want you to start thinking about that. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're gonna go through some questions. The first I'll ask is, what happens if one of the furloughed employees do not want to return back to site that they're called back in? What should an employer do in that case?
What should an employer do? Next slide. Let's see what he can do. Here's a kind of a thought process. Only half of employers have even established objective criteria for determining the order in which employees should be recalled to work. You need to be thinking about that right now, whether they come back to work next week or whether they come back to work in November. How are you going to determine the criteria for determining the order of return? With this high level of employee resistance and continued uncertainty regarding safety and unemployment benefits, both employer and the employee need to understand the legal ramifications of their return to work decisions. And trust me, there are legal ramifications, there are organizational ramifications, there are operational ramifications, and we will explore it. Next slide, please. Here's something that I've kind of titled Return to Work Decisions That Are Not Discriminatory. As you might imagine, the minute I use the word discriminatory, that had a legal implication. I did not mention this, but I also happen to have a law degree, and I'm non-practicing. So not only am I an HR consultant, I have a heavy legal background, and I'm bringing that to the table as we start to discuss this. Employers can choose to recall employees based on any legitimate, non-discriminatory factor. Now, what does that mean? Legitimate, because if you use the term legitimate, you have to be thinking, well, what's illegitimate? If you use the term non-discriminatory factor, then you have to ask the question, what's discriminatory? Unless an employer has an agreement or policy in place requiring employees to be recalled in some specific order, once closures are lifted to given locale. So suppose you have a contract. I would imagine that the people on this webinar do not have unions or contracts, union contracts. I would be surprised if you had individual employment contracts with employees. If you have one that addresses return to work, you have to follow it. If you don't, you have free reign to do anything you want, again, if it's legitimate. If I don't like so-and-so because he's fat, so I'm not calling him back. I don't like Susan coming back because she criticized my leadership last quarter. That's not legitimate. I'm not calling so-and-so back because, listen, she's pregnant. And that might not be good for her. When you're not doctors, to my knowledge, you can't determine whether a pregnant employee is or is not capable of doing work. You could question it, but the way you would question it, you would ask her physician and you would pay for it for a fitness for duty. Because in that case, you might be concerned about that person's safety or health, which is a little bit different from being discriminatory. You're trying to make sure that you are taking care of that employee because you don't want that employee to hurt herself or the baby, all right? So suppose you're a small employer. I doubt very seriously if you have in your employee policies and procedure handbook, and please don't tell me, oh, we only have 4 employees, we don't need a policies and procedure handbook. If you have 1 employee, you need a policies and procedure handbook. Assuming you have one, the question would be, do you address seniority? In other words, And how do you define seniority? Suppose you had somebody who's been there 15 years, but they don't have the expertise in a category that you need. But you have someone who's been there 6 months and they have that expertise. That 6 months person would be the person you want because they have the expertise you need, as opposed to the person who's been there 15 years and they don't have the expertise. Job position. I'll give you an example. I do a fair amount of work for the medical industry. Suppose we have a critical care nurse and an obstetrics nurse. A nurse is a nurse is a nurse, right? No. So suppose the normal obstetrics nurse is out on leave or whatever. Well, no problem. We just switch the critical care nurse over to the obstetrics, because after all, a nurse is a nurse is a nurse. If you did that, you would be incurring huge liability. So let's be careful about job position. This is why I have all of my clients, regardless of size, give me at least a one-page bulleted job description that lets me know what is expected of that individual in that job, because it can help me in decision-making in so many operational and organizational ways. Documented performance history. Suppose Joe is an idiot and you were going to discipline Joe. You might even had considered terminating Joe, and then COVID happened. And you had larger fish to fry, and you said, I'll put Joe lower on my priority. But now you're starting to look at recall. Why would you recall Joe if you were going to discipline him up to and possibly including termination over a performing individual contributor? That is not discriminatory. That is using good judgment.
Right.
Joe might not like that. But remember, you have the documented performance history. You have documentation that Joe has been a bad employee, and to put it another way, he had one foot in the grave and another on a banana peel. So if Joe is outraged that you didn't recall him, I would advise Joe to be as quiet as possible, okay? So I want you to think about that. What was your decision-making skills in determining who comes back and in what order? It could even be and who remains working at home as to who comes back on site. Next slide, please.
Okay, so you talked about the factors, and then what are some maybe non-factors of?
There we go. Unless contractual obligations precluded, what I mean is you have a contract, an individual employment contract, or you have a union contract, it is perfectly okay to ask for volunteers. Doesn't mean you have to accept the volunteers, but you would like to see who's out there who might be interested in coming back on site, and determine who returns first. Employees who recall or do not recall workers based on, for example, age, child care responsibilities, perception of disabilities, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, because you cannot justify those as criteria for making the decisions about who remains at home and who comes back. Go back, Catherine.
Sorry about that.
Okay. If you do that, you run a very big risk of being hit with a discrimination claim. And even if you win, look at the staff time and money it's going to take to fight it off. I cannot tell you how many of my clients have good cases, but it would take them too much time to go to court to fight it. So what they do is what's called nuisance payments. Just to get rid of it, we'll pay you X amount of money, we want a waiver and release, and you go, rather than go to court. I was talking to one of my clients today, And we looked at the nuisance, and this is a, by the way, this is a Des Moines employer with approximately 145 employees. To date, they have paid a little over $100,000 in nuisance claims.
Wow.
And this is not COVID related, this is just performance related. One of the things we're working on going forward is, can we reduce this nuisance claim to something that's manageable? And we've agreed, at least the first time out, over the next 12 months, manageable will to get it down from $100,000 to perhaps 15. We don't know if we can do it, but that's what we're striving for.
Right.
Now, this is why you see I've highlighted document, why you did what you did. A lot of my clients say, if I do that, they can use it against me. No, if it's done well, it can be used to help you. We did not do what we did with Bill because of his age. We did what we did with Bill because of Bill's past performance. We did what we did with Bill because when we looked at the budget, we only had X amount of money due to we've been off almost 4 months, revenues have been lowered, and we can only bring back X amount of people. And when we look at the priority of what we need, Bill was not in the mix. That's not discriminatory. That's being very, very deliberate in making your decisions about recall.
Awesome.
Okay.
So I do have a question. Somebody asked whether or not employees who have children, could that be a factor in returning to work?
Beg your pardon? If you don't have children?
Can whether or not employees have children be a factor for returning to work?
Not in America. We know that's a reality, but that cannot be a legal criteria for making that decision. And I know that might sound unfair and that might sound heartless, but think about it. If you make that decision for employees who don't have kids versus employees who do have kids, how do you explain that without being discriminatory? How do you justify it? And that's been an issue for some time, particularly as it relates to single folk. And I'm not suggesting that single folks don't have kids. I'm just saying to you that folks will say, well, he doesn't have kids, so we can assign him to this team because this team is going to work late, so they don't need to go home. You can't make that kind of decision. And if you do, you basically have caused your own self liability. Does that answer that, Catherine?
Yes, that does. Thank you.
Okay. Next slide, please.
Okay, so you've asked your employees to return to work, and you've talked about the different guidelines you've discussed. What happens when the employee refuses to go back?
You know what I tell people? You can do anything you want in this world, but you have to be aware of consequences. Now, it's the employer's responsibility, in my opinion, to make sure that before an employee makes a decision, he or she is aware of the consequences. Okay?
That's fair.
So if an employee refuses to return to work, and the reason why is because he or she, and here's some of the reasons that we're hearing, they want to keep receiving unemployment compensation, because in certain cases, you can make more getting unemployment than you can working.
Right.
Or how, if let me see, did we miss a slide?
I don't think so.
Would you go back one? Just,
No.
okay, go back to that slide, okay. If the employee refuses, and you made it clear to the employee, you realize that what we ask you was a reasonable demand or request or direction, you will be deemed legally to have voluntarily resigned. Now, let me share what that means. If you have voluntarily resigned, you would not be eligible for unemployment insurance.
Right.
So if you refuse to come to work, okay, so let's deal with it in the real situation. The employee is scared to return to work on site because well, let me put it another way. They're not currently entitled to job protected leave. So that's not a guarantee. I'll use my leave and wait it out. Well, they too would be deemed to have voluntarily resigned. And if you look at my note, it's a big deal because many of the states have a version of rule that requires employees to be willing and able to work in order to continue to receive unemployment benefits. So if an employee resigns by refusing a recall, he may be disqualified from receiving further unemployment compensation. So that's why it's important that we make sure the employee understands the consequences of his or her decision. It would not be fair if they refuse that we did not share that information with them. After they had that information, because they would say, I wouldn't have done it if I had known this. Well, the employer says, it's not my responsibility. You're a grown person. You're supposed, no. Fairness dictates that you inform these people. You're not threatening them. You're giving them information so that they can make a decision. Now, whatever decision they make, but now they understand the consequences.
Right. Yeah, with workforce development, that is one of the things that they tried to clarify on with the COVID unemployment benefits. So,
I'm sorry.
no worries. So with the ADA considerations for disabilities, how does that how does that impact return to work refusals?
Give me my bullet now. I want my bullet now. Okay. So suppose a person has an underlying medical condition and we say you need to come back to work. I would say on this one, this is a case by case. Because, you know, some of these underlying medical conditions, the employer can accommodate. Others, they can't. I'll give you a good example. Suppose you have an employee who is morbidly obese and requires an extra wide wheelchair. Suppose that when that employee returns to work, there's a location that you need that employee to be, and he or she has to go through 4 or 5 doorways with that extra wide wheelchair. Now, it may cost you anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 per doorway to accommodate that extra wide wheelchair. That's unreasonable. You do not have to spend that money to change those doorways to accommodate that morbidly obese person in that extra wide wheelchair. And this is just a business situation. That is asking an employee to go above and beyond what's required. Because as most of us know, the typical doorway is either 32 or 36 inches wide. A typical extra wide wheelchair is 42 to 48 inches or more. You can't shrink the wheelchair, and to have to change 5 doors at $2,000 or more a pop is unreasonable.
What would be considered a reasonable accommodation?
If you, That's a good one. If you couldn't find another place to put that person that makes sense, sometimes you need employees where they need to be around their team, or they could be in a satellite, and it could be in a different location. You would have a duty to see if you could find an alternative. But if you could not find an alternative that was reasonable within your budget and your operation, you literally do not have to keep that employee. Now that sounds harsh, but what is important is you go through the exercise, and you go through the exercise in good faith. You don't do it as a ruse. You actually are trying to find a way for that person to be able to work at your shop that you can accommodate. But if you can't accommodate them after going through that exercise, you have dismissed your obligation.
All right. And then do these underlying medical conditions, does that include like immunocompromised people? Would that fall under this category?
It could. It could. That's why I said case by case. And the beauty of that is you have carriers who you pay. They have experts who you can, and a lot of people don't take advantage of this. You pay these people all these premiums, make them work. Call them, have them take a look at your situation and help you find a way. And in many cases, they can find a way, or they can validate you've done all you could and you can do no more.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, next slide.
All right, so at-risk employee who wants to return to the facility once it has reopened.
Now, what do we talk about? What do we talk about when we say at risk? That may be someone who may have ADA issues. That may be someone who has been identified that they are COVID positive. As you know, more and more people have, for whatever reason, and I'm not judging, I just had a situation where one of my barbers at a six barber shop had just come back from a trip to Orlando, Florida. Now, one could argue that when that person returned, he should have 14-day quarantine. So I'm sitting here in my barber chair, and I know that this guy just got back from 14-day quarantine. Check it out. Excuse me. She started talking. What can I tell you? So I had to advise my barber, he needed to apprise that other barber that they were a danger and a risk to the other barbers as well as customers. That barber is at risk because, as you know, Florida is one of the states that's spiking. And the barber says, well, I wore a mask and I didn't go to the beach. But like, you stayed in a hotel with those people who didn't wear a mask, who did go to the beach. So, technically speaking, you cannot decide to keep employees home simply because they are considered vulnerable under CDC guidelines. But here's my thought. If you believe that even though the employee has the ultimate decision as to whether they can and come back to work, if you believe that they are a threat to themselves, to other employees, and to your customers and clients, I would rather have them outside spitting in than have them inside as a danger to all my other folk. I would take that chance, because if you did a look at a risk analysis, I would think you'd come out better by trying to protect the whole versus one individual's rights. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are saying that's very controversial. I just told you that you can't decide and the employee decides. But you can't also allow yourself and your crew, your troops to be exposed when you know. The minute I heard that this guy had just got back from Orlando, Florida, I'm like, hold it, stop. And even though that barbershop was set up with 6 feet of distance between the barbers and 6 feet of difference between the customers waiting, that's a danger. So I advise my client, time out, time out. Protect the whole over the individual. And I realize this is controversial, and I would imagine it's going to stir up a fair amount of conversation, but that's just my advice and that's my opinion. But I wanted to give you kind of the backstory because you may be confronted with this. Of course, you can check with an attorney, you can check with a healthcare official, but let's be frank, if you're a small business, I'm not so sure you have all those resources available to you. And I'm just talking, as the young people say, on the real. Okay? Next slide.
All right, so what considerations should management have regarding communication, since you said communication is what this is about?
Please give me my next slide, Catherine. I need it. As you prepare to recall your people, be sure that you are communicating and sharing your plans with them. Now, here's the problem. A lot of people think they're communicating, and what they're doing is providing gibberish, okay? Communication means people understood what it is you were saying, whether it was verbal or whether it was written. I believe in transparency. I do not believe in being cute. I do not believe in holding stuff back. I've had employers say, if I gave this information to them, they could use it against me. They could use it anyway. And more importantly, they might get the information from someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. So wouldn't it be better if they trusted you to provide information? So I said provide them with information regarding how you intend to conduct the recall. How are you going to do it? What is your process? Put it in writing. Well, if I do that, they can hold me to it. Of course they can hold you to it. Do you really care? That's how you're going to do it. Provide them with your rationale for the recall sequence. This is what we're going to do, and this is why we're going to do it. I tell people all the time, the one thing I love about journalism, what do they say? Who, what, where, how, and when. I think that can go into almost any industry. If you can answer those questions, I think you're going to be in good shape. Inform employers of the potential repercussions for unemployment benefits. Again, you would rather stay at home and be unemployed so you can collect your benefits. We've gone over how that works. That might not be available to you if you refuse recall. Provide information about any and all safety measures. I want to know, are we going to practice social distancing at the workplace? I want to know what you're doing to help me protect myself, because I don't want to bring this home to my family. So suppose we have health screening. How about face mask as a requirement and PPE distance, including looking at your HVAC ventilation, because as you know, that circulates around. Show them, tell them and show them what you're doing to the best of your ability and with the resources you have. This is what we're trying to do to protect our employees. And as you know, and I'm jumping ahead of the game, but OSHA has come out with a kind of guide that pretty much gives you good direction of what you should be doing to prepare your workplace for the return of your workforce. And believe it or not, I've had my difficulty with OSHA, but somebody must have sent the message to them. Be clear, be precise, be instructive, and I would recommend, and it's free, and you can get it online. Of course, you can use other resources, again, physicians, attorneys, so forth and so on. But I would say to you, this OSHA assistance is, excuse me, very good. And it also gives you a platform, even if you use these other resources. It kind of gives you a guide to what you should and shouldn't do. Next slide, please.
All right, so now that we've discussed all the kind of the background and considerations that we have to take, what are some good policies and procedures as we're considering returning to work, and can you give us some examples of that?
Okay, give me my next slide, please. Policies and procedures for employee groups must address strategies to increase safety and reduce the risk of infection. Please don't come up with these policies that even you can't understand. You know what I mean? I see people who somehow figure, and I'm dating myself, they feel like they have to be Perry Mason. This is not a legal document. This is a document for instruction and guidance. If you can't explain it, it needs to be rewritten. And if you can't explain it with a short sentence or two, it needs to be destroyed, okay? Cohorts can be created based on characteristics like office location, department, or job function. What I mean is like people in like areas if you can do it. Because then that allows for consistency. It allows for continuity. And I'll tell you something else it allows for, collaboration. Remember when everybody wanted the open offices?
Right.
Guess what? Maybe that's not the way of the future anymore. You know what I mean? Well, we can get up and mosey around and chit chat and be one big family. I don't think so. Look at what you're doing and look at your budget. And you know what I ask people all the time? I'll give you a good example. I had a situation, and I won't name the state, where a hospital was built, and it was a 5-story hospital. And they had the big time architects, they had the administrators, they had everybody. And when it was on opening day, they realized something. Somebody had forgot to build in nursing stations for a 5-story hospital. And somebody said, how could you build a hospital and not have nursing stations? And the question was, did anyone ask the nurses? Not one person asked the nurses what they needed. Can you imagine trying to explain, how can you build a hospital without nursing stations? And the nurses said they didn't ask us. You might find the answer to your question, ask the people. What do you think you need to be safe, but also productive? Let's see what we can find. They may find solutions that cost you so little money you'd be shocked. And I lived in New Jersey for a few years, and the best line I loved in New Jersey, if you didn't understand something in New Jersey, they have a saying, you better ask somebody. The problem is in New Jersey, they do ask people, so you have to be careful. I know that's not fair, and my apologies to anybody from New Jersey, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. But my point is, be transparent. Involve your people in your decisions where they're effective when you can. Give direct access to these guidelines. You may have forgotten something. That hospital forgot to ask the nurses about how they could work effectively. And can you imagine the mud on these people's faces? How could you build 5 stories with no nursing station? I also say in this new digital world, provide a platform to share updated policies quickly. I just instituted something this morning with a client where they can go on their website to what we call their internal internet.
Yeah.
So employees can go on and find out what's going on that directly affects them. They don't have to rely on the grapevine. And I stole the idea from Google Drive. Instead of having to repeat 100 times to people, go to Google Drive. And they can answer your question. Not only can they answer your question, you can leave a comment. This sucks. You know what I mean? So my point being is, one of the other things that's starting to happen, this new normal, this new reality, things are not going to be like they were. Use that digital universe to work for you. All right, next one, please. A policy and procedure that sets up screening protocols for employees returning to work site. We're going to have protocols. We're going to check for symptoms to be in compliance. We're going to give people the tools they need. You can do this now, I understand, with a smartphone. Managing worksite occupancy. Don't jam people into rooms or places that are not safe and healthy. That's why I said many of you will find that even if you wanted to, you can't bring everybody back on site, that you may find because of social distancing issues, you may have to have people back at home. Did you know what's happening for a lot of the big corporations? They're trying to figure out how to sell these buildings before nobody buys them because they don't need them anymore.
Yeah, all the remote workers.
Yeah, they don't have the workers, so why do we need these elaborate workplaces? Next slide.
Okay, so compliance, right? Like, so we have all these things put in place. How do we make sure that everyone's on the same page and following the procedures?
Okay, I'm looking at my clock and I see we're running a little bit over.
We are running over.
And if you have to go, my apologies, you have to go. But this is recorded, isn't it, Kathleen?
It is recorded, yep.
So if you have to go, you can come back and visit for this last part. If you can remain, I will try to be move a little faster. But as you might guess, this is some complex stuff. And I wanted to make sure that I gave you the tools you needed for the decisions that you're going to have to make. Complying with the new safety guidelines helps make the workplace safer. They have to be followed by everyone. There are no exceptions. Education and development, to me, is a key to good employee performance and productivity. So we don't want a cadre of dumb, ignorant employees. We want well-developed, well-educated employees who sometimes may even differ with where we want them to go. But it is our job, using logic, using something that makes sense to, let's face it, what are we constantly doing with customers and clients? We're convincing them they need our product or our service. No different from your employees. We're convincing them we need them to take these steps and these actions so we can provide that product and that service. We're going to find that we're going to be doing a lot of things electronically that we normally didn't even think about doing. And look how fast it is. And I've had clients who for 15 years have run from the internet, who absolutely refuse to participate in it. But in the last 15 weeks, they have adapted.
Yeah, they have to, right?
They have to. And what's funny, some of them gotten cute with it, you know what I mean? I had one show me something that we could do on Zoom. I didn't know Zoom could do it. They're like, oh yeah, you don't do that? I'm like, no. Next slide.
Oh, I think that was...
That was it. If there are any questions, I would certainly like to entertain them.
I don't see any currently. So to reach Ted, you can go to the Williams Group website. And is that the preferred number that they...
That is the preferred number. That is our office number.
Awesome. All right. And then for Community CPA side, again, this will be up on YouTube. It'll be on Facebook, but you can reach us. You can contact me directly, Catherine at communitycpa.com. Call us. That is our office number, the 515 number. It'll reach all three of our branches. And then we are always having these webinars at 3 o'clock. So we hope to see you again next time. And Ted, I wanted to thank you so much for taking this time and sharing your wisdom with us and your experience. So
I'd like to thank Community CPA. I'd like to thank Ying and the crew. I truly enjoy sharing this kind of information, particularly at this time. Everybody can use a little support, everybody can use a little guidance, and everybody can use a little direction. I appreciate how trying these times are, but I always believe that no matter how tough it is, with the right support system, we'll be okay.